So much of Canada's history and our history through immigration is a collection of stories, so I'd like to start with a very brief one. On August 29th, 1900, in the village of Zavar in Slovakia, a woman named Maria Krajkovic was born. The town itself was very, it's a farming, very small town, primarily agriculture. And she grew up there. She married a man named Frank Arovic, and they had two young daughters named Helen and Stefania. And in the early 1930s, when both of their girls were still quite young, under the age of 10, I believe under the age of 7 actually, Frank decided to travel to Canada to work with the CPR. And that was a very difficult decision at the time, because you can imagine leaving your wife with two young daughters at a time when Europe was becoming increasingly more uncertain. It was something that was a quite difficult decision. Maria actually had to sell some of her property, move in with her mom in order to take care of her daughters, while Frank was overseas working to save enough money and send money back to the family. And thankfully Maria was quite a talented seamstress and needlework, and she made beautiful lace and was able to support a small amount of living for her daughters. However, in the late 1930s, things became very unstable in Slovakia. It was actually in March of 1939, I believe, when things got really serious. And I don't have my dates correct here, and I should for telling a story, but I believe it was in November 1940 where essentially Hitler's Nazis took over the country. So it was a very bleak time indeed for the citizens of Zavar. So in in July of 1938, Maria did all of the paperwork and it was very difficult at this time to get her two young daughters to a point where she could travel overseas and join her husband in Canada. And that actually happened in July of 1938, so right before all of this happened. They actually traveled to Winnipeg to start a home, and at this time, Helen was 15 years old. They didn't come to Canada with anything, like nothing. So Helen had to work to clean homes. She put herself, while she worked close to 15-hour days, she actually put herself through school in the evening to learn English. And she worked really hard, and she ended up marrying a man who was 25 years her senior, and she had 5 girls, and they farmed in Starbuck. And she has been known to say that you're lucky if you got 1 good year out of 5. When her daughters were all very young, she was widowed, and she had to make the decision to move into Winnipeg with her 5 young girls as a widow. She worked 2 jobs to put food on the table, and one of her 5 girls, Kim, recounts not seeing her mom very often, but Kim put herself through school as well. She got married very young. She had 2 daughters named Sherry and Michelle. And Kim went back to school when she was in her 30s, and Helen decided that she was going to spend her retirement years raising Sherry and Michelle. And she imparted many values of Slovak heritage, hard work, and ethic into those girls. And I have my family's Voyage of Passage, actually the original one, here today. And I remember when I found this document in my grandmother's house as we were packing her house up to put her into an assisted living facility. And I remember asking her, you know, why would you make the decision to do this? This was, you know, why did great-grandma bring the family overseas? And she said to me, we did it to be safe, to be free, to build our future and yours, and to build a better country. And with that in my heart, I find myself here today in Canada's Parliament speaking to this bill before us today. So Canada is a country of immigrants who stand on the traditional lands of and shoulder to shoulder with First Nations and Aboriginal peoples, who bring their wealth of experience, their thoughts, their hopes, their desires, and their dreams together under a banner of pluralism, of freedom, and of language. This makes us unique. Our diversity is our competitive advantage. It keeps our economy growing. It keeps our public policy discourse vibrant. It enriches our civil society, and it keeps us hopeful and optimistic. And because of this, in my view, immigration policy in Canada should never be about why. It should be about how. And in this, I believe that my Liberal colleagues and I are united. This bill contains a lot of how. It contains fundamental changes to how and under what circumstances we grant citizenship into our country. And for that, it should be scrutinized carefully and objectively, which I will try to do now. First of all, this bill has several components. The first component the Minister has already spoke to, and it's the removes the grounds of the revocation of Canadian citizenship that relate to national security. So the Minister spoke at length at this. You know, I am really enjoying this critic portfolio because I do believe that many of the public policy challenges that we will be facing in the next 10, 20 years in Canada, especially since we have an aging workforce, immigration is core to those challenges, and immigration policy is core to dealing with those challenges. And I do believe that new Canadians enrich and strengthen our country, their experiences and perspectives, as much as, you know, my experience is grounded in the experience of immigrants. It makes us stronger. As I said, it leads to more vibrant public policy. My concern with this particular element is that, of this bill, is that, first of all, it is the government's first priority. It does revoke the citizenship of a convicted terrorist, and I don't think that we can be glib or flippant about that. I will be the first one to admit that this particular section of this bill was highly contentious during the election campaign. But because it was contentious doesn't absolve us in this place of the ability and the duty to speak to it. I find it very shocking that this is the government's first priority in this bill, and I don't accept the argument that this it somehow created two classes of citizen. It does not. And there are other grounds by which citizenship can be revoked, which the Minister didn't really speak to. I was looking at, during the Minister's speech, an article about, I believe that there were 2 Nazi war criminals in, I think it was 2007, that had their citizenship revoked. Citizenship can still be revoked on grounds of fraudulent methods. So there are other provisions in a Canadian law, which this bill does not change, that allows for citizenship revocation. The discussion here around this provision is really boils down to at what point and what we value about Canadian citizenship. The Liberal government have put forward the following argument, that if you are a convicted terrorist and you are a dual national citizenship, that the government believes that you can serve your term out in jail, and that is an appropriate penalty for that. The alternative to that is that if you are a dual national citizen and you have committed a terrorist act against Canada, which does affect all Canadians, as what we saw here in October of 2014 affected all Canadians, that your citizenship should be revoked. So I would ask the Liberals that as we go forward in debate here, I'm trying to be very respectful of this, that we don't debase this conversation to a fallacy that it creates two classes of Canadian citizenship. What it's done, what it is a choice on punishment for a very serious act against our nation. This bill makes a choice in that regard. And for that reason, I oppose this particular section of the bill. How much time do I have left, Mr. Speaker? 10 minutes. Second section of this bill removes the requirement that an applicant intend, if granted citizenship, to continue to reside in Canada. You know, as I was cleaning out this trunk in my grandmother's basement, it's incredible. I found newspaper clippings from the 1940s, the Winnipeg Free Press, which talked about the role of the Slovak community during the wartime, and it's sort of nascent roots that were forming in Winnipeg. And those people that moved to Winnipeg, my family, my ancestors, it wasn't all about tough times, it was about joy. My great-grandma wrote a play. She was an actor. I guess there's, something that was inherited in there. But, she contributed to the community. I found records of my great-grandfather who fundraised for the Slovak Catholic parish in Winnipeg. When you come to Canada, when we celebrate immigration and we celebrate diversity, we should be celebrating the fact that we want people to stay here and enjoy the experience of being a Canadian and contribute back into our country. It's what's made us amazing. Yeah. It's what we should be celebrating as we're working up to Canada's 150th anniversary. And I think it's quite reasonable, given that this is the spirit that binds our pluralism together, to say that when you want to become a Canadian citizen, you intend to stay here and make this nation stronger as we commit to do the same for you. And I think that by taking this out, that actually removes the spirit and the intent that was put in this section of the previous legislation. The third component of this bill seeks to reduce the number of days during which a person must have been physically present in Canada before applying for citizenship. The same argument applies there. There was, I was reading the committee testimony for the bill that was previously before Parliament, which made some of these changes. And some of the quotes can kind of be distilled into, the longer an individual lives, works, or studies in Canada, the greater connection that person will have to our beautiful and special country. So I don't see this as a punitive measure. I don't. I say, if you want to become a citizen of this country, and I hope you do, if you become a citizen of this country and you want to participate in, if you want to run for office, or if you want to vote, or all of the privileges that are accorded with Canadian citizenship, that time in which you're spending here is something that gives you a greater understanding of Canadian pluralism. That what unites us are things like gender equality, freedom of speech, freedom of sexual orientation, the things that allow us to function and coexist as a nation of many nations under the same common banner. You need to experience that to be a Canadian citizen, and that's where the spirit of this change was. And that's my concern with reducing it as well. I also don't think that this provides an unnecessary barrier. I'm looking forward to witnesses at committee that can argue otherwise, but going into that debate, my sense here is that it imparts the value of Canadian citizenship, and it imparts to people who are going through the citizenship process that Canada wants to invest in you during that process. We want to welcome you into our cultural institutions. We want you to learn what it means to be a Canadian citizen. We want you to understand the public policy dialogue. The fourth section deals with, it limits the requirement to demonstrate the knowledge of Canada and one of its official languages to applicants between the ages of 18 and 54. Previously, that restriction was set at 64 years old. Mr. Speaker, we often talk about one of the public policy challenges that we'll be dealing with in the next 10 years is how we continue to knit together Canada's pluralism, what I just spoke about, as we increase and embrace more Canadians. And I will add that our government did welcome over 1.6 million new Canadians to Canada during its time in office, which was a significant number, and it was also year over year on an annualized basis, significantly more than the previous government did. I applaud their efforts to look at the citizenship numbers and situations, but I also think that to give credit where credit due is we did increase that number significantly. But as we continue to do that, and as we look at our pluralism, there are many things that unite us, and language is one of them. Language is a unifier. Language binds us together. It allows us to have shared common experiences, to communicate together, and I really strongly believe that rather than talking about reducing the age limit, that what we should be talking about is if it is a barrier for someone over that age, and 55, Mr. Speaker, I would argue isn't that old. You know, 55 is probably the new 18. I don't know, but it's not that old. Somebody at 55 years old or 54 still, I would argue, has a significant amount of life experience to contribute. And I would say that if it's a barrier to learning the language, then how do we overcome the barrier? You know, one of the things that concerns me about the Syrian Refugee Initiative are reports that new immigrants and new people coming to Canada through that initiative are waiting for months for access to language training services. So I'm not sure why the government's first reaction in this bill is to lower the language requirements rather than saying, how can we help you learn the language? It's important. It allows you to participate in so many different facets of Canadian society in a way that opens doors to you. It allows you to experience so many different things. And to me, that's why I think language proficiency is so important. And again, I'm really curious as to why the government would reduce this, and it's something that I look forward to hearing about at committee as well too, because my gut reaction to this after, you know, I found some of my grandmother's notes, and she worked 15 years old. She worked so hard to learn English. She put herself through that program herself. You know, I think that we should be asking, how can we help someone do that, rather than just reducing the requirement at the first instance. There are other components of this bill which are, I believe, they're more technical amendments, which I do support. But overall, I just feel that, especially in the context of the government's tabling of its immigration levels report yesterday, the government has made a significant change to the ratio at which we have people who come to Canada under economic immigrations classes like the federal skilled worker programs versus those who come in through streams such as the refugee initiative. A separate policy argument for a separate time. But in the context of the provisions of this bill, those numbers are very important. When we're talking about a 250% increase to refugees coming into Canada, and our first reaction is to lower the language barrier, or is not, well, I hope we lower the language barrier. I hope we can have, you know, language training services, but the age in which you can become a Canadian citizen without language proficiency, that's an issue. When we talk about changing the intent to reside in Canada, when we're increasing overall numbers of immigrants to Canada, I think that that's an issue. How are we providing services? And then, you know, Mr. Speaker, I asked a question to the minister earlier, which is serious. There are so many people who want to come to our country that processing times are an issue. You know, it's something I hear about every day, spousal sponsorship processing times. How can we fix that? So if we're changing the system in such a way, and we're changing the formula by which how many people come to this country, and we don't have a plan to resource that, either through processing times or providing a long-term housing to somebody who's come through the Syrian, you know, my colleague from the NDP, and I can't remember her riding name, but she's in Vancouver, Spikes, Vancouver East. You know, she talks about 70% of Syrian refugees still being in temporary accommodations. And I think regardless of political stripe, that's something that we need to be concerned about. So, Mr. Speaker, my concern with this bill is that it puts the cart before the horse in a lot of ways, that it looks at issues that perhaps aren't of utmost concern with regard to immigration policy in Canada. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we can come to some sort of consensus, because this is something that is going to affect our country over the next 10 years. We need people from other countries to ensure that skilled labor isn't a determinant to economic growth, that we have access, that we are meeting our humanitarian obligations overseas, that we are looking at family reunification, but we're doing it in a way that's resourced, in the context of a budget that's manageable, and in the context of an overall plan for the economy that allows that Canadian advantage, that thing that brought my great-grandmother over with 2 young girls and nothing else to this country. So, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for this, and I hope I've conveyed my thoughts in a very nonpartisan manner, and I'm happy to take any questions.